What is up, guys? Doug Polk here, and we're back for another episode of Poker Hands. But before we jump into it, I want to talk about another channel I'm going to be creating here on YouTube. We already have the first video up, and it's going to be a channel more dedicated to non-poker stuff. Sometimes I find that I want to make a funny video or I have a good idea, but it's not in the realm of poker. And I think this channel is, about poker. It's a poker strategy, poker jokes, poker news. So I want to keep this channel based around poker, but also have a channel where if I have an idea for something funny I can do, or I have something that I want to talk about, I don't have to be so confined to poker as well. So if you are interested in checking that channel out, I have my first video uploaded about learning the ropes on YouTube. You might find that funny. You can check that out either at the end of this video or in the description box below. Okay, so with that out of the way, I want to head back in time to 2014 to the $1 million World Series of Poker 1-drop. And because we each had a heads-up hand, and I feel like the heads-up juices are flowing, I want to look at a hand played between Negreanu and Colman, heads-up for the bracelet.
It's been a very competitive heads-up match so far. Negreanu with a slight edge over the 23-year-old Dan Colman, who has ace-4 of diamonds. He raises to $2.5 million. Negreanu with king-queen. And he will come along for $1.3 million more.
Play begins with about 50 big blinds heads up, and Dan Colman elects to raise ace-4 of diamonds to about 2.1 big blinds on the button. Definitely the standard play, and at this stack depth, I'm probably either going to raise or fold all of my buttons. In the big blind, Negreanu now has king-queen and a decision to make. Should he 3-bet or should he flat? Now, I think both decisions have some merit, but 3-betting does have a problem. If you 3-bet king-queen and get jammed on, you're likely going to have to fold. That said, if you're going to use a smaller 3-bet size, you could elect to call a small 4-bet, but you're still going to have a problem if they decide to jam with a hand like sevens or ace-jack or any of these kinds of hands that you might have the odds to call, but don't want to put your tournament life on the line because they can have hands like queens plus ace-king. So, I think calling here is fine. It's the conservative option. If they were a little deeper, I'd like to see maybe a 3-bet. Or if you think your opponent's not likely to 4-bet you much, I also like a 3-bet. That said, pre-flop in this hand's totally standard. Let's take a look at the flop.
The flop is 4, 8, jack, 2 spades, 1 diamond. Negreanu missed. He checks the pair of 4s for Colman.
Colman was going to quit poker in the summer of 2012 and go back to college, but he messed up the applications and decided to give poker another shot.
He bets $2.5 million.
Negreanu hasn't won a bracelet here in Las Vegas since 2008. His 2 bracelets last year came in World Series Asia Pacific and World Series Europe.
The flop comes jack 8-4 with 2 spades and 1 diamond. Both players flop backdoor flush draws. Negreanu flops 2 overcards and Colman flops bottom pair. Negreanu checks it over to him as he should with all of his hands, and now Colman has an interesting decision. Should he bet his bottom pair or check? Now, generally I prefer to check these hands because if you bet, you put yourself in some awkward situations. What's he planning on doing versus a raise? Probably call, but then the turn's going to get quite dicey. Also, if he bets and faces a call, his opponent can have all kinds of hands like a jack or an 8 that have him beat. That said, he did use a small size, which lets him get some value against hands like king-queen, or some straight draws, or maybe even some ace-highs. But I think, again, I would prefer to check this hand and look to play some turns. Now it's over to Daniel in the big blind, and he also has a couple of options. He could elect to raise, planning on barreling when he hits a king or a queen, 10 for a straight draw, or a spade and represent a flush, or he can decide to check call and take a showdown value. I probably prefer the option he took here of check calling, because if your opponent's bluffing, you're ahead, and check raising could put you in tough spots if you get re-raised. You're going to have to fold and lose your equity in the pot. That said, maybe Colman was on to the way Negreanu was playing these flops, because if you look at how this bottom pair bet is going to work out, he's actually going to get some value here with his bottom pair against this king-high hand. If I'm Negreanu and I see hands like this showdown, I'm much more likely to look to check raise some hands in the future. That said, maybe he thinks he's going to check raise some flush draws and some straight draws, and he doesn't really need to use a hand this strong as a check raise in terms of his showdown value. Anyway, I'm okay with the flop bet and okay with the flop call. Let's check out the turn.
Turn card now. Ace is up for Colman. Negreanu with a flush draw and a Broadway draw. He checks.
Negreanu looking for his 7th bracelet. Colman seeking his 1st. They don't know anything. Please.
Colman now bets $7 million.
Well, Negreanu has picked up straight and flush draws. And he might even think if he hits his king or queen on the river, that might be the best hand. I don't think Negreanu's going anywhere.
Negreanu looks almost defiantly at Colman as he reaches for his chips. Colman nonplussed. And there is the call.
The turn is the ace of spades, which is a really, really interesting card. Maybe even the most interesting card in the deck, because the way that this hand played, Colman probably doesn't have ace high. A lot of those hands are going to check back on the flop. And Daniel isn't really check calling too many ace highs on the flop. He's more likely to have hands like pairs or straight draws or flush draws. So, maybe he could have a few hands like ace 10 with a spade, so he will have a few aces. But now that there's an ace out there, it's much less likely he has that. So both players really kind of miss their hands on this ace. I don't think anyone really gained too much of an advantage here. So Negreanu checks, as he should with all of his hands. And now Colman decides to bet with his top and bottom pair. And this hand's really going to be standard from Colman from here on out. But back over to Negreanu, now his opponent is sort of saying one of two things. He's either saying, hey, I have a jack, and I'm going to bet here to check on the river. I have an ace that somehow decided to bet the flop and am now going for some value. Or I have two pair plus, two pair sets, flushes. But from Negreanu's perspective, think about all of the kinds of hands Colman could be bluffing with. 6-5 suited, 7-5 suited. I mean, this is heads up. Doesn't even have to be suited. It could be 6-5 off, 7-5 off, 7-6 off, 10-9 off, 9-7 off, 10-7 off. There's tons of gut shots here. And also, if you bet a hand on the flop that had a spade in it, he could decide to continue to barrel. So there are lots of hands that he could potentially be bluffing with. He's not that likely to have an ace. And Negreanu has a pretty strong hand. On a 10, he's going to make a Broadway straight. On a spade, he's going to make a flush. On a king or a queen, he's going to make a pretty good pair. So there's a lot of options here from Negreanu. Now, he decides to check call, which I think is reasonable. Maybe you could even argue this hand could be a hand to put into your check raise and try and represent a flush. Let's say you had a hand like a flush here, right? Let's say you're Negreanu and you have a 10 high flush. Well, what you would be worried about is Colman having a jack or an ace and betting the turn to try and check it back on the river, giving himself a cheap showdown. So if you see someone bet a jack on the flop, bet a jack on the turn, and then check the river a bunch, you should start trying to check raise them more on the turn with hands like king-queen to put them in a tough spot. That said, if he's bluffing, you have a lot of showdown value, and so I'm totally okay again with the call. Let's see the river.
Another 4 on the river. Colman River's a full house.
Negreanu missed everything. Colman's got everything, and he's going to try to get value here, but there's not a bet he can make that Negreanu can call.
Negreanu checked a third time, and now up to Colman. Can he get anything more from Negreanu? Wow, he's putting a lot of his troops together. I guess no thin value bet here. 18 million.
That's 18 million.
I guess Kid Poker's taking one last sip of water before he folds.
Colman has been aggressive from the get-go in this hand.
Wow, Daniel doesn't Hollywood. I guess he's wondering if king high could be good here.
18, right?
I guess he could figure Colman might have like 10-9 and kept betting a straight draw.
The river is an offsuit 4, giving Colman a full house, and Negreanu bricks having only king high in the river. Negreanu checks over to Colman, and Colman decides to bet 18 million into a pot of about 24 million. This is a very, very large bet. It's a 3/4 pot bet. Now, what's interesting here is Colman's no longer saying he has a jack or an ace. He's essentially saying, I have a flush or better. Maybe he's saying he has a 2-pair hand or better, a hand like ace-jack, a hand like ace-8. But he's certainly not saying that he has just a jack or just an ace. He's saying he has a very strong hand. Now, over to Negreanu with king-queen here. Negreanu has an interesting hand to think about. If Colman's bluffing, he's going to have a hand like 10-9 or 6-5 or something like that. He's not really going to have a hand with a king in it. If he has a king in his hand, he's unlikely to take this line. So when Negreanu doesn't have a low card or a mid card there, it's actually pretty relevant to the situation because Colman's more likely to be bluffing. That said, Negreanu's hand is still very weak. In general and heads up, if someone bets 3 times and you're in the big blind, I would say a good general rule, if I had to just make it really simple for you, would be if you have top pair on the flop, calm down. If the board gets really dicey, look to call with hands that are stronger than that top pair on the flop. This board is something in the middle. I would say if Negreanu has an ace here, he should always call. And if he has a hand like a jack, he might look maybe more in the middle ground between folding and calling. That said, king-queen here is just simply too weak. Having the queen of spades, while you might block some flushes, it also removes some hands he could bluff with. What if Colman had queen 10 or queen 9? You know, what if he just had queen 7 with the queen of spades? These are all hands he might choose to bluff with that he can't possibly have now because Negreanu has the queen of spades. Another interesting option here that Negreanu could have done, he could have jammed on the river. And I actually think that it would be a pretty reasonable play. Maybe he would rather have the king of spades instead of the queen of spades, so you know your opponent doesn't have the nut flush, and that could be a fine way to try and play it. But king-queen is simply too weak here. You don't have to call on the river with all of your hands and heads up just because you're playing heads up, even though, as we learned from a recent video, sometimes you should call people down. You want to be careful with which hands you elect to call with. If you have a hand like Jack 8 here or Ace 8 here, it's a lot better because now your opponent is less likely to have hands like a set of 8s, a set of Jacks, a set of Aces, or hands like 8-4, Jack 4, Ace 4. So you want to try and block more of those full houses, and additionally, you don't want to be calling people down with some of the worst hands you can have. I mean, what worse hands can he really have? I guess Queen 10, right? Queen 10? You never have to call with some of your worst hands if you're facing a bet. Just fold and call the right amount with the hand strong enough to see you a showdown.
Negreanu has been lauded for years about his ability to read his opponents. He needs to be right at this moment or he'll take a big hit.
Negreanu just with king high. Remember, Colman called Negreanu earlier just with queen high.
So perhaps a suspiciously large river bet from Colman has Negreanu thinking about this.
18 million, 18 million. I don't think you have good cards. But I could be wrong.
This is as wrong as he's ever been.
Full house. Whoa! That's good. Yeah, nice.
What a play from Colman at a critical juncture and got Negreanu to make the call.
I was not drawing dead.
I believe Negreanu's bottled water was contaminated, and that affected his read. That's the only plausible conclusion I can come to.
I thought I was good there.
All right, thank you for joining me here today for Poker Hands. I'll see you guys soon. If you guys are interested in checking out my new channel, you can either click the clickable annotation box here on the screen, or you can check the description below for a link to the channel.